Chapter 11. Well played, Midwich. I am really sorry, Bernard Westcott wrote to me early in May, that circumstances preclude well-deserved official congratulations to your village on the success of the operation to date. It has been concluded with a discretion and communal loyalty which, frankly, has astonished us. Most of us here were of the opinion that it would prove necessary to take official action well before this. Now, with only some 7 weeks to go before D-Day, we are hopeful that we may get through without it. The matter which has given us the greatest concern so far was in connection with Miss Fraser, on Mr. Crimm's staff, and so, one might say, not the fault of the village proper, nor even of the lady herself. Her father, a naval commander retired and a fire-eater of some truculence, was bent on trouble, all set to get questions asked in the house about loose living and orgiastic goings-on in government establishments, anxious, apparently, to make a Fleet Street holiday of his daughter. Luckily, we were able to arrange for suitably influential people to have a few effective words with him in time. What is your own opinion? Do you think Midwich will last it out? That was far from easy to answer. If there were no major upset, I thought it might stand a good chance. On the other hand, one could not fail to be anxiously aware of the unexpected, lurking round any corner, the small detonator that might set things off. We had had our ups and downs, though, and managed to get through them. Sometimes they seemed to come from nowhere and spread like an infection. The worst, which looked at one time like becoming a panic, was allayed by Dr. Willers, who hurriedly arranged X-ray facilities and was able to show that all appeared to be quite normal. The general attitude in May one could describe as a bracing up, with here and there an impatient desire to let battle commence. Dr. Willers, normally an ardent advocate of having one's baby in Train Hospital, had reversed his usual advice. For one thing, it would, particularly if there should be anything untoward about the babies, render all attempts to keep the matter quiet utterly useless. For another, Train did not have the beds to cope with such a phenomenon as a simultaneous application by the whole female population of Midwich, and that alone would certainly have been fuel for publicity, so he went on wearing and flogging himself to make the best local arrangements he could. Nurse Daniels, too, was tireless, and it was a matter for thanksgiving by the whole village that she had happened to be away from home at the critical time of the day out. Willers, it was understood, had a temporary assistant booked for the first week in June, and a sort of commando of midwives signed up for later on. The small committee room in the village hall had been requisitioned as a supply base, and several large cartons from firms of manufacturing chemists had already arrived. Mr. Leabody was working himself dead tired, too. There was much sympathy for him on account of Mrs. Leabody, and he was more regarded in the village than he had ever been before. Mrs. Zellaby was holding resolutely to her solidarity line, and, aided by Janet, continued to proclaim that Midwich would meet whatever was to come with a united front and unafraid. It was, I think, chiefly on account of their work that we had come so far with, except in the matter of Mrs. Leabody and one or two others, so little psychosomatic trouble. Zellaby had operated, as might be expected, in less definable capacities, one of which he described as chief liquidator of the All My Iron Crystal Balls division, and he had shown a pretty knack of causing nonsense to wilt without putting backs up. One suspected that he was also supplying quite a little help where there was need and hardship. Mr. Crimm's worries with his establishments branch continued. He had been making increasingly urgent appeals to Bernard Westcott, and reached the point of saying that the only thing that would save a scandal throughout the civil service soon would be for his research project to be switched, and quickly, from ministerial to War Office control. Bernard, it seemed, was trying to achieve that, insisting the while that the whole affair must be kept quiet for just as long as it was possible to hold it.
"Which, from the Midwich point of view," said Mr. Crimm, with a shrug, "is all to the good, but what the devil it can matter to M.I., I still don't begin to see."
By mid-May there was a perceptible change. Hitherto the spirit of Midwich had not been ill-attuned with that of the burgeoning season all around. It would be too much to say that it now went out of tune, but there was a certain muting of its strings. It acquired an air of abstraction, a more pensive mien. "This," remarked Willers to Zellaby one day, "is where we begin to stiffen the sinews." "Some quotations," said Zellaby, "are greatly improved by lack of context, but I take your meaning. One of the things that isn't helping is the nattering of stupid old women. What with one thing and another, it is such an exceptionally good wicket for Beldam. I wish they could be stopped."
"They're only one of the hazards. There are plenty more." Zellaby pondered glumly for a while. Then he said,
"Well, we can only keep on trying. I suppose we've done pretty well not to have more trouble with it some time ago."
"A lot better than one thought possible, and nearly all of it due to Mrs. Zellaby," the doctor told him. Zellaby hesitated, and then made up his mind.
"I'm rather concerned about her, Willis. I wonder if you could, have a talk with her."
"A talk?"
"She's more worried than she has let us see. It came out a bit a couple of nights ago, nothing particular to start it. I happened to look up and found her staring at me as though she were hating me. And she doesn't, you know. Then, as if I had said something, she broke out, 'It's all very well for a man. He doesn't have to go through this sort of thing, and he knows he never will have to. How can he understand? He may mean as well as a saint, but he's always on the outside. He can never know what it's like, even in a normal way. So what sort of an idea can he have of this? Of how it feels to lie awake at night with the humiliating knowledge that one is simply being used, as if one were not a person at all, but just a kind of mechanism, a sort of incubator, and then go on wondering hour after hour, night after night, just what it may be that one is being forced to incubate. Of course you can't understand how that feels. How could you? It's degrading, it's intolerable. I shall crack soon. I know I shall. I can't go on like this much longer."
Zellaby paused and shook his head.
"There's so little one can do. I didn't try to stop her. I thought it would be better for her to let it out. But I'd be glad if you could talk to her, convince her. She knows that all the tests and X-rays show normal development, but she's got it into her head that it would be professionally necessary for you to say that in any case, and I suppose it would."
"Well, it's true, thank heaven," the doctor told him. "I don't know what the devil I'd have done if it weren't. But I know we couldn't have just gone on as we have. I assure you the patients can't be more relieved that it is so than I am. So don't you worry. I'll set her mind at rest on that point, at any rate. She's not the first to think it, and she'll certainly not be the last, but as soon as we get one thing nailed, they'll find others to worry themselves with. This is going to be a very, very dodgy time all round." In a week it began to look as if Willer's prophecy would prove a pale understatement. The feeling of tension was contagious and almost palpably increasing day by day. At the end of another week, Midwich's united front had weakened sadly. With self-help beginning to show inadequacy, Mr. Leabody had to bear more and more of the weight of communal anxiety. He did not spare any pains. He arranged special daily services, and for the rest of the day drove himself on from one parishioner to another, giving what encouragement he could. Zellaby found himself quite superfluous. Rationalism was in disfavour. He maintained an unusual silence, and would have accepted invisibility, too, had it been offered.
"Have you noticed,"
he inquired, dropping in one evening at Mr. Crimm's cottage,
"have you noticed the way they glare at one? Rather as if one had been currying favour with the Creator in order to be given the other sex. Quite unnerving at times. Is it the same at the Grange?"
"It began to be," Mr. Crimm admitted, "but we got them away on leave a day or two ago. Those who wanted to go home have gone there. The rest are in billets arranged by the doctor. We're getting more work done as a result. It was becoming a little difficult."
"Understatement," said Zellaby. "As it happens, I've never worked in a fireworks factory, but I know just what it must feel like. I feel that at any moment something ungoverned and rather horrible may break out, and there's nothing one can do but wait and hope it doesn't happen. Frankly, how we are going to get through another month or so of it, I don't know."
He shrugged and shook his head. At the very moment of that despondent shake, however, the situation was in the process of being unexpectedly improved. For Miss Lamb, who had adopted the custom of a quiet evening stroll, carefully supervised by Miss Latterly, that evening underwent a misadventure. One of the milk bottles, neatly arranged outside the back door of their cottage, had somehow been overturned, and, as they left, Miss Lamb stepped on it.
It rolled beneath her foot, and she fell. Miss Latterly carried her back indoors and rushed to the telephone. Mrs. Willers was still waiting up for her husband when he came back 5 hours later. She heard the car drive up, and when she opened the door he was standing on the threshold, dishevelled and blinking at the light. She had seen him like that only once or twice in their married life, and caught his arm anxiously.
"Charlie, Charlie, my dear, what is it? Not—"
"Rather drunk, Milly. Sorry. Take no notice," he said.
"Oh, Charlie, was the baby—"
"Reaction, my dear. Just reaction. Baby's perfect, you see. Nothing wrong with the baby. Nothing at all. Perfect."
"Oh, thank God for that!" exclaimed Mrs. Willers,
meaning it as fervently as she had ever meant any prayer.
"Got golden eyes,"
said her husband.
"Funny, but nothing against having golden eyes, is there?"
"No, dear, of course not."
"Perfect. Except for golden eyes."
"Not wrong at all." Mrs. Willers helped him out of his coat and steered him into the sitting-room. He dropped into a chair and sat there slackly, staring before him.
So silly, isn't it?" he said. "All that worrying, and now it's perfect.
He burst suddenly into tears and covered his face with his hands. Mrs. Willers sat down on the arm of his chair and laid her arm round his shoulders.
There, my darling. It's all right, dear. It's over now."
She turned his face towards her own and kissed him.
"It might have been black or yellow or green or like a monkey. X-ray's no good to tell that," he said. "If the women of Midwich do the right thing by Miss Lamb, should be window to her in the church."
"I know, my dear, I know. But you don't need to worry about that any more. You said it's perfect."
Dr. Willers nodded emphatically several times.
"That's right. Perfect,"
he repeated, with another nod.
"Except for golden eyes. The golden eyes are all right. Perfect. Lambs, my dear, lambs may safely graze. Safely graze. Oh, God, I'm tired, Milly."
A month later, Gordon Zellaby found himself pacing the floor in the waiting-room in Train's best nursing home, and forced himself to stop it and sit down. It was a ridiculous way to behave at his age, he told himself. Very proper in a young man, no doubt, but the last few weeks had brought the fact that he was no longer a young man rather forcibly to his notice. He felt about twice the age he had a year ago. Nevertheless, when 10 minutes later a nurse rustled starchily in, she found him pacing the room again.
"It's a boy, Mr. Zellaby," she said, "and I have Mrs. Zellaby's special instructions to tell you that he has the Zellaby nose."
Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe to hear more great stories.